Neville Chamberlain might be the best recent historical example of a man who, through giving inches, ended up giving away miles. I am, of course, referring to Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, which he held due to somewhat justified fears that had emerged in the wake of World War I, given the massive loss of human life and the destruction that he had borne witness to, the proportions of which had hitherto been unknown and unseen. This fear led to the Munich Agreement in 1938, which resulted in France and Britain accepting the cession of the Sudetenland within the Czech region to Germany, which caused in of itself untold problems. Chamberlain famously believed and stated in a speech that he had, through this concession, bought peace in our time. But this was not to be. The next year, Hitler annexed the regions of Bohemia and Moravia, which was later followed by his invasion of Poland in September of 1939. It was a bet, and one that Neville Chamberlain, and subsequently the world, had lost. The historical snippet is as relevant today as it ever has been. The cardinal sin that Chamberlain had committed was the sin of assuming the quality of good faith in the person he was dealing with. There are larger implications to this, contemporary implications to this, in fact. Retrospectively, it is safe to say that Chamberlain had approached the situation from the perspective of someone who feared the possibility of a revivification of mass conflict in Europe, someone who imputed the same fears to the leadership of other European countries, and someone who had unfortunately assumed that his concession, granted that the previous statements were true, would result in a peaceful Europe. Of course, Hitler had already invaded and acquired Rhineland in 1936 with little to no opposition, so really, it wasn't a safe bet, but nonetheless, that appears to be the train of thought that Chamberlain likely had. And history is riddled with such stories. Based on a far older tale, likely part myth and part history, cobbled together in pseudo-historical accounts of Middle-aged Britain, we are told of the treachery of the Long Knives, not to be confused with the much more modern Night of the Long Knives, which took place in Germany in 1934. In the wake of the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the Brythonic king, Vortigern, had called upon the aid of continental Germanic mercenaries, led by the warlords Hengist and Horsa, the stallion and horse, with the promise of a concession of land to them and their tribes upon successfully completing their task, specifically granting them the Isle of Thanet, a tiny island in the southeast of England. The Saxons, however, were not satisfied with the dispensations offered to them. Under the pretense of further improving the security of Britain for the sake of Vortigern, Hengist and Horsa brought over many more of their brethren, with a long-term ambition of conquering the entire isle. After much conflict between Vortigern's son and the Saxons and many misunderstandings, a meeting was called between all parties to settle differences. As much as the Celts sought to heal embittered wounds, the Saxons had less than benign intentions. Hengist had secretly been amassing many thousands of men with the intention of employing them for conquest, and prior to the meeting, he'd instructed each of his men attending to hide saxas, or long knives, after which the Saxons had been named, in their clothes. When the time was ripe, he shouted, "Nehmet ur saxas," or "Let us draw our blades," and the Britons, not knowing the Saxon tongue, knew not what they heard, and each British man, unknowing and unsuspecting, was cut down. Whatever the ultimate veracity of the treachery of the Long Knives, this period and the events connected to it marked the beginning of the greatest cultural and linguistic change that had ever taken place in the British Isles, forever changing its landscape. And both stories, one rooted in documented history, the other a patchwork of myth and history, remind us of a constant in human behavior, namely, that favors granted are often abused, and that it is often the case that when inches are given, leagues, not miles, are taken. The quality of good faith assumes that the person or group one is interacting with has, at the very least, similar intentions, but more often than not, this is not the case. Whether it was the gullibility of King Vortigern or the naivete of Neville Chamberlain, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And we who are alive in this epoch have all borne witness to the constant concessions made to people with less than good intentions. And though we are temporally separated from Chamberlain and our situations seem very different indeed, upon closer inspection there are some remarkable similarities. Chamberlain's experiences led him to make decisions that were primarily motivated by fear and yielded questionable results. And if we fast forward to the current year, though different, we find ourselves living in the shadow of the largest conflict that has ever taken place, almost 75 years on, World War II. Most of the original concessions made to various groups were predicated on the idea of equality before the law, something most people, including myself, find perfectly reasonable and sound. But looking back upon previous decades, it becomes questionable as to whether or not that was the intention of the groups to actually achieve in the first place, and consequently be satisfied with the rather boring and conventional position of being just another small fish in a vast, vast sea. Minority groups and women had made a pretense of seeking an equal footing under the law, a perfectly reasonable concession for most people, transforming it into a desire to be something greater than that. And here, the goodwill and well-wishing of those granting the desires expressed by these groups was turned on its head, because those who had made concessions, repeatedly granting inches, ended up losing miles upon miles of what used to be deemed sanity, always with the fear that somehow, some way, not giving away ever more privileges and special rights to the caterwaulers might just land us in a situation similar to the events of World War II, perhaps the proverbial gates of Auschwitz. The preposterousness of such a fear should be clear to anyone, and it was and is simply unwarranted. But it is this very fear that is weaponized against those with good intentions. It is not something on the scale of the events of World War II that is an actual impossibility, but rather that the world in no way, shape, or form resembles one that would likely lead to that morbid state of affairs. But the ship of opportunity to point that out has long since sailed. The fundamental problem with concessions is that those to whom things had been conceded were also demanding things from a rather skewed perspective from the outset. Take the basic premise of feminism, for example, namely that men uniquely have some privilege in human existence, and the mere endowment of a penis grants you special rights, powers, and influence. Of course, the misperception should be clear to anyone, as well as its absurdity. But inherent in that view, deeply woven into it, was the idea that freebies and special treatment were the province of men, and women who, by way of contrast, have always been treated as a function of their humanity, as opposed to utility, could not see the world for what it was. And now we are privileged to bear witness to the ever-growing cascade of demands put on imaginary figures and structures in the world that, by dint of the fact that they are imaginary, can never be sufficiently met nor satisfied. And yet we try. Equal pay for equal work, predicated on the fiction that the work and hours put in were always identical to those of men's. Perfect parity in terms of workplace gender distribution, predicated on the myth that men and women are identical in their interests and inclinations, etc. Nonetheless, this must be striven for, and if need be, at the point of a gun, implemented. Whilst it is perfectly understandable and legitimate that people who are treated in unfair ways and subjected to actual violence and cruelty would seek to redress the suffering they have been through, the distorted nature of what constitutes suffering and violence in today's atmosphere, where mere words and clothing are sometimes likened to such things, has reached the point where it simply cannot be taken seriously anymore. The reality of our current state is that people who comprise fringe elements of society are not suffering any more than people who are not part of those elements, and that it can be almost unilaterally asserted that the word that best describes people seeking special privileges beyond equality before the law and basic tolerance, that word would be selfish. Yes, selfish. At some point in time, it must be acknowledged that there will never be enough concessions made to groups that demand them, be it the teaching of transsexuality to young children, forced quotas in terms of ethnicity and sex, or anything else that might come to be regarded as a right. And at some point in time, someone needs to make clear that the buck stops here, because there is limited time and there are limited resources. I am neither conservative nor parochial. Rather, my concern is born of pragmatism. How much time and money are we wasting seeking to address irredeemable grievances? Grievances and complaints that will never end. The only requirement that is necessary in a civilized society is that people who live in it treat each other with decency and normal human kindness. No category of personhood or fringe element needs to be highlighted and elevated beyond this basic principle when it comes to human interaction. And when they claim that when they are not granted their laundry list of demands, that the next genocide looms nigh, we can safely and confidently dismiss such concerns as they do not reflect the reality we live in. But this is where the difficulty comes into play, because the powers that be fear that they might be called something unpleasant. In other cases, the fear is founded on the possibility of losing employment, or perhaps status. Some of these concerns are legitimate, some less so. Then the demand for concessions will never end, as testified to by history. Hitler was not satisfied with just Sudetenland, nor were the Anglo-Saxons with a small island off the coast of Kent. They wanted more, and actively sought more, and so too do these people. The ideological divide is simply too great to ever assume good faith operators, and it is too great to make even the slightest concession anymore going forward. Because, as has been stated, with these people, inches always lead to many, many leagues, with no end in sight, until the whole experiment we call Western civilization collapses in on itself, and then there will be no more inches to give. Thank you very much for watching. As YouTube has demonetized this channel, it now operates solely off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers. Please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.